So imagine for a second that your entire civilization is just wiped off the map. I mean, completely erased from the physical world.
Right, like your capital city is burned to ash.
Exactly. Your king is blinded, he's bound in these heavy bronze chains and dragged away. And the elites, the artisans, the priests, they're all marched across a desert into exile.
And your temple, which is the literal house of your deity, the absolute center of your entire cosmos, is demolished until not one stone is resting on another.
Yeah, in the ancient world, that scenario is the end of your story. That is the final period at the end of the sentence. You disappear from history. You just assimilate into the empire that conquered you, and maybe, I don't know, 3,000 years later, a team of archaeologists finds a few broken pottery shards with your name on them.
If you're lucky.
Right. But today, for our deep dive, we are looking at a stack of historical notes, archaeological research, and ancient texts about the one group of people who took that exact apocalyptic scenario and somehow used it to invent the foundations of the modern world.
We are, of course, talking about the ancient Hebrews. And the timeline we are covering here spans roughly from 3000 BCE down to about 500 BCE.
So a huge chunk of time.
A massive chunk of time. We're tracking a small, really politically vulnerable population wedged into a narrow strip of land right between the massive predatory empires of antiquity. And the overarching question driving our entire discussion today is one of survival mechanics.
Like, how did they do it?
Exactly. How did this tiny, fragile group of farmers and herders invent a way to remain a civilization without relying on the hardware of an empire? Because, while the Egyptians were building pyramids that could be seen for miles,
Strange monuments.
right, and the Assyrians were building this terrifying, unstoppable military administration, the Hebrews built a civilization out of text, out of law, out of communal memory, and ethical obligation.
They essentially figured out how to survive the end of their own world, which is just wild to think about.
It really is.
Now, because we are dealing with source material that eventually became sacred text for billions of people today, we have to navigate this carefully. We are looking at this history through two distinct overlapping lenses.
Right, the theological and the secular.
Yeah. So on one hand, we have the biblical narrative, the Torah. This is the theological, idealized memory of a people trying to make sense of their relationship with the divine. And then on the other hand, we have the secular, historical, and archaeological record.
Physical evidence.
Exactly. We're looking at inscriptions dug out of the dirt, settlement patterns, carbon dating, and comparative ancient Near Eastern history. And I want to be super clear here. We aren't here to pick a theological or political side. We are just putting these two lenses together to impartially report on what they say, to see where they overlap, where they diverge, and how they paint a picture of just an incredible historical anomaly.
And before we get our boots on the ground in the ancient Near East, we should establish a quick baseline for the terminology we're going to be using today. Because the identity of these people shifts as their political situation changes over the centuries.
It's not just one static name.
No, not at all. When we use the term Hebrews, we're broadly referring to the mythic or biblical origin story. The ancestral figures moving through the landscape, like Abraham, Isaac, and Moses.
So Hebrews is the earliest, almost ancestral designation.
Correct. Then as we move into the historical period where these people begin settling in the highlands of Canaan and forming early kingdoms, we use the term Israelites.
Okay.
And this covers the era of the tribal confederacies and the early monarchies.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed, leaving only the southern kingdom of Judah, which was centered around Jerusalem. So from that point forward, we'll refer to them as Judahites.
And then ultimately we hit the term Jews.
Yes. Jews, or early Judeans, becomes the historically appropriate term as we get closer to 500 BCE. That emerges after the Babylonian exile, when their identity completely cements around the Torah, the temple, and the reality of living in a diaspora.
Okay, with those ground rules set, we really have to start with the physical dirt. Because you can't understand the psychology of a civilization until you understand the ground they are standing on.
Geography is destiny in a lot of ways.
Geography dictates survival, and survival dictates worldview. So we're talking about the Levant. If you look at a map of the ancient Near East, the Levant is this incredibly narrow land bridge on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea.
It's a tiny sliver of land.
Yeah. To the southwest, you have the giant of Egypt. To the east and northeast, across the desert, you have the giants of Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Babylon.
It is the ultimate contested corridor.
Yeah.
I mean, if Egypt wants to trade with or attack the Hittites in the north, they have to march their armies right through the...
Way through their backyard.
Exactly. And if Mesopotamia wants access to the Mediterranean or wants to threaten Egypt, they march through the Levant. It is quite literally a highway for empires.
Wow.
But the early Israelites didn't develop their distinct culture on that highway. They didn't settle in the fertile coastal plains where the trade routes ran, or in the rich, flat river valleys. They pushed up into the rocky, rugged central highlands.
And I want to focus on the stark contrast between those highlands and the massive empires, because the mechanics of ancient agriculture directly built their opposing views of the universe.
Absolutely.
Take Egypt, for example. The entire Egyptian civilization is essentially a subsidiary of the Nile River. The Nile floods every single year with this predictable, almost mechanical rhythm.
Like clockwork.
Yeah, it deposits rich, black silt, waters the crops, and then recedes.
Yeah.
If you are an Egyptian farmer, the cosmos feels fundamentally stable, the universe is reliable.
Right. The gods are doing their job.
So you build a massive centralized bureaucracy to manage the distribution of that grain, and you look at your pharaoh as the living embodiment of that reliable cosmic order. The river is a god, the pharaoh is a god, and everything is under control.
And you see a very similar, though maybe slightly more chaotic, dynamic in Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Yeah.
These are massive hydraulic civilizations.
Right.
They require monumental irrigation systems, which require centralized government, which requires a king with absolute authority to tell everyone when to dig the canals.
But the central highlands of Canaan offer absolutely none of that.
Not at all.
There is no massive, predictable river system. The Jordan River sits in a deep, plunging rift valley, which makes it largely useless for the kind of vast lateral irrigation networks you see in Egypt or Babylon.
So if you're an early Israelite settling in the Judean or Sumerian hills, you are practicing something incredibly precarious. You are relying on rain-dependent agriculture.
Which sounds terrifying in that climate.
Oh, it is. You're trying to grow barley, wheat, grapes, and olives on the side of a limestone hill. And your entire existence relies on the autumn and spring rains. If the rain comes, you eat. If the rain doesn't come,
Your crops fail.
your crops fail and your family starves. It's not a minor inconvenience like it is for us today. It's an existential threat. And this physical vulnerability breeds a completely different psychology. It creates a theology of profound anxiety and, conversely, intense daily gratitude.
The ecological reality of those highlands forces a worldview of direct dependence, and the biblical texts are absolutely saturated with this.
Oh, everywhere you look.
The constant references to rain, drought, famine, the early rains, the latter rains, the dry wilderness. This isn't just poetic or spiritual imagery. It's a literal reflection of their survival mechanics. It is the voice of people staring at the sky, knowing that a shift in wind patterns means starvation.
Yeah, so let's talk about the actual mechanics of surviving on those hills, because it required an immense amount of physical engineering just to eat. We are looking at a structure that archaeologists have dubbed the four-room house.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this wasn't just a place where a family slept, right?
Not at all. It was a highly optimized miniature economic engine. The four-room house is the quintessential architectural fingerprint of the early Israelites.
Walk us through the physical layout of this structure, because it reveals exactly how they lived.
Sure. So if you approach one of these structures, you're looking at a rectangular building divided into three parallel pillared aisles, with the fourth room running perpendicular across the back.
Okay.
The ground floor was essentially an agricultural processing and storage center. The central courtyard might be open to the sky to let out smoke from cooking fires. And the side aisles were used to stable their most valuable livestock, their sheep and goats.
Wait, they brought the animals inside the house?
Yes. And bringing the animals inside served a dual purpose. First, it protected the flock from predators and thieves, which is crucial. And second, the body heat of the animals actually rose to warm the upper living quarters during the really cold highland winters.
That is actually brilliant. Gross, maybe, by our standards, but brilliant. And then the back room, that perpendicular space, that's for deep storage.
Yes, that is where you find the massive ceramic storage jars called pithoi. This is where they kept the olive oil, the grain, and the wine. The upper level, accessed by a ladder or external stairs, was the living and sleeping area for the extended family.
Wow.
But what the architecture of the four-room house really tells us is the sheer volume of labor required to sustain a household. Because they are on rocky hillsides, they couldn't just, throw seeds on the ground.
All right, it's all limestone.
Exactly. They had to invent terracing. They had to physically pry limestone boulders out of the earth, build retaining walls along the contours of the hill, and backfill those walls with dirt just to create a flat strip of arable land that wouldn't wash away in a rainstorm.
And water management was a nightmare, right? Because without a river, they had to dig cisterns out of the solid limestone bedrock beneath their houses just to catch rainwater.
Yes.
And limestone is porous, so if you just dig a hole, the water seeps away. So the sources say they had to invent a specific type of slaked lime plaster to coat the inside of the cisterns. If that plaster cracked, your water supply vanished, and your family was basically finished.
And we really cannot discuss the economic engine of this household without centering the invisible, grueling, and absolutely essential labor of women.
Right, this is huge.
The formal, legal, and public structures of ancient Israel were unequivocally patriarchal. The public square belonged to men, but within the walls of the four-room house, the economic survival of the family was completely driven by women.
And the physical evidence for this in the archaeological record is just staggering. Let's talk about grinding grain, because this wasn't just a quick 10-minute chore.
Oh, not at all. Before the invention of the rotary quern, which are those circular millstones we associate with later periods, ancient people used a saddle quern.
What does that look like?
It's a large, slightly concave bottom stone and a smaller top stone that you push back and forth to crush the wheat or barley into flour. Women would spend 3 to 4 hours every single day kneeling on the stone floor, using their entire body weight to grind the day's flour.
3 to 4 hours a day just grinding flour.
Just for flour.
Yeah.
And the bioarchaeological evidence, the actual skeletons recovered from these periods, shows severe physical alterations in the joints of women.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we see crushed toes, arthritic knees, and degenerated lower spines solely from the mechanical stress of grinding grain. Combine that with weaving textiles, managing food preservation, pressing olives, and hauling heavy water from the cisterns. If the women stopped working for even a few days, the entire microeconomy of the village collapsed.
That reality totally shifts how we need to view their economy. In our modern world, the economy is just numbers and jobs. You know, it's GDP, it's the stock market, it's a number on a screen. You can lose your job, you can declare bankruptcy, and it's devastating, obviously. But you are still a citizen of your country. You still have an identity.
You don't lose yourself.
Exactly. But in the ancient highlands, the economy was completely intertwined with identity. Land wasn't a commodity you speculated on. It was your bloodline. It was your inheritance, your connection to your ancestors, and your literal physical place within the covenant with God.
The loss of land was the ultimate existential dread.
Right.
If a drought hit or a crop failed, a family would have to borrow grain from a wealthier neighbor just to survive the winter or to have seed for the next planting. If the next harvest also failed, they couldn't pay back the loan.
Yeah.
And the interest rates in the ancient Near East were just exorbitant.
Like predatory lending.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Eventually, the family would have to forfeit their ancestral land, and when the land was gone, the only collateral left was their own bodies. They would have to sell their children, or themselves, into debt slavery.
So going bankrupt wasn't just losing your assets, it was having your identity completely erased. You ceased to be a free Israelite and became a dependent piece of property.
Yes.
Knowing that, their legal texts suddenly read less like dry religious rules and more like desperate, radical safeguards against that specific nightmare, which brings us to the invention of what we might call an economic morality.
And we see this most vividly in the concepts of the Sabbath year and the Jubilee. The biblical law mandated that every 7 years, agricultural land had to lie fallow to rest, and all debts between Israelites were to be canceled.
Just working.
Wiped clean. Hebrew debt slaves were to be freed. And then the ultimate reset button was the Jubilee. Every 50 years, any ancestral land that had been sold off or forfeited due to poverty was supposed to automatically revert to the original family.
Now, secular historians look at this and ask, did the Jubilee ever actually happen? Did wealthy elites ever voluntarily hand back massive tracts of valuable land just because a calendar hit 50 years?
Right. Human nature says no. And the consensus is that the Jubilee on a national scale was likely a utopian ideal rather than a strictly enforced historical reality.
Okay.
There is very little historical evidence of a society-wide land redistribution actually taking place. Wealthy landowners rarely surrender their leverage willingly, then or now. However, the fact that this law was written down, enshrined in their sacred text, and fiercely defended by their prophets is revolutionary. It poses a radical question to the ancient world. Who actually owns the earth?
The empires around them had a very clear answer to that. The king owns the earth, the pharaoh owns the earth.
Right.
But the Hebrew text says something entirely different. It says the land belongs to God and humans are merely tenant farmers, aliens, and temporary residents. Therefore, no human debt, no matter how legally binding, has the authority to permanently disinherit a family from their future.
And you see this exact same moral impulse in the gleaning laws.
Oh, I love the gleaning laws.
Yeah, the laws of the harvest dictated that a farmer was not allowed to reap the very edges of his field, nor was he allowed to go over his vineyard a second time to pick up fallen grapes.
Right, you had to leave it.
Exactly. That surplus was legally reserved for the most vulnerable members of the society, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner residing among them. In a subsistence economy where every calorie is a matter of life and death, commanding farmers to leave food on the ground is a profound moral statement. They took the brutal, extractive, zero-sum economy of the ancient world and injected it with an inescapable social conscience.
Living precariously on the edge of a mountain, surrounded by neighbors who might enslave you if you had a bad harvest, clearly shaped their domestic life. But those decentralized, fiercely independent highland families couldn't stay isolated forever, because this contested corridor was getting crowded.
Very crowded.
You have the Philistines consolidating power down on the coastal plains, wielding superior organization and iron weapons. And the Israelites are sitting up in the hills with bronze tools and pitchforks.
It's a huge mismatch.
It is. So they realize they need to organize a state, they need an army, they need a coordinated defense, they need leadership. But that creates a massive philosophical crisis. If you despise the crushing weight of the Egyptian pharaoh, how do you create a king without becoming the very empire you escaped?
It is the central political trauma of their early history. If we look at the period of the judges, prior to the monarchy, the biblical texts describe a fiercely tribal, decentralized society. The recurring phrase in the book of Judges is, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
It's just total frontier justice.
Exactly. When a crisis arose, a charismatic warlord or judge like Gideon or Deborah would rally a few tribes, repel the immediate threat, and then power would diffuse back to the clan elders. But temporary warlords are not enough to stop a permanent, well-drilled military threat like the Philistines.
So they decide they need a permanent king. And the biblical account of this moment is incredible. The elders go to the prophet Samuel and say, "Give us a king to lead us so we can be like all the other nations." And Samuel is horrified.
He is.
He essentially acts as a political scientist, predicting the exact trajectory of authoritarianism. He doesn't say, "Great, let's draft a constitution." He issues a brutal warning.
Samuel's warning in 1 Samuel chapter 8 is one of the most remarkable anti-monarchic texts in the ancient world. He lays out the mechanics of statecraft to them. He warns them, if you appoint a king, he will draft your sons to run before his chariots and fight his wars.
Yep.
He will take your daughters to be perfumers and bakers in his palace. He will confiscate the absolute best of your fields and vineyards to pay his courtiers. He will demand a tenth of your flocks, and eventually you yourselves will become his slaves.
It's the ultimate devil's bargain. It's like, imagine a small, tight-knit neighborhood watch realizing a heavily armed cartel is moving into the city. The neighborhood watch knows their flashlights and whistles won't cut it, so they hire a ruthless mercenary gang for protection.
Right.
They know the mercenaries will keep the cartel out, but they also know the mercenaries will eventually take over the neighborhood, tax them into poverty, and run their lives. They are adopting the weapons of the empire to survive the empire.
And that tension defines the entire history of the Israelite monarchy. They proceed with a king anyway. First is Saul, who is this tragic, transitional figure who never quite establishes a stable administration and falls in battle against the Philistines.
Saul.
Yeah. Then comes David, the idealized warrior king who finally unites the northern and southern tribes, defeats the Philistines, and captures the fortress city of Jerusalem, making it a neutral capital. David's son, Solomon, follows, and he is the one who centralizes power, builds the first temple in Jerusalem, and establishes a complex royal administration.
But right here, in this 10th century BCE period of David and Solomon, is where the two lenses we talked about, the biblical text and the secular archaeology, clash the loudest.
This is a major point of debate.
Yeah, because the text describes Solomon's kingdom as a glittering, massive empire of staggering wealth. Gold shields, ivory thrones, massive stables, thousands of wives and concubines, trade fleets bringing exotic animals from across the known world. It sounds like an empire that rivals Egypt. So what does the actual dirt say?
The dirt tells a much more modest story. and it has been the source of intense academic debate for a long time. For decades, some secular archaeologists, known as minimalists, argued that David and Solomon might be entirely mythical figures.
Like King Arthur.
Exactly like King Arthur. Legendary heroes invented centuries later by a people desperate for a glorious past. But that extreme minimalist position was shattered in 1993 with the discovery of the Tel Dan stele in northern Israel.
Oh, I love the story of the Tel Dan stele. Explain what this artifact actually is and why it changed everything for archaeologists.
It is a broken basalt stone slab, essentially a victory monument, erected in the 9th century BCE by a Syrian king named Hazael. Written in Aramaic, the inscription boasts about his military victories. Crucially, he claims to have killed a king of Israel, and he explicitly brags about defeating a king of the house of David.
Wow.
Yeah. This is non-biblical, physical evidence from an enemy king confirming that a dynastic lineage tracing its origin to a founder named David was recognized on the international stage just a century or so after David would have lived.
So David was absolutely real, but the scale of his kingdom is still debated.
Exactly. While the dynasty was real, the archaeological consensus suggests that 10th century Jerusalem under David and Solomon was not a glittering imperial metropolis. It was likely a small, relatively poor highland stronghold.
Okay.
The massive, sprawling empire described in the Bible is understood by historians as a theological memory, a retroactive projection of glory, written down by later generations to symbolize an idealized golden age of unity before everything fell apart.
But what matters most isn't how much gold Solomon actually had. It's the ideological cage they built around the concept of the king. Because they did something no other ancient civilization dared to do. They placed the law above the monarch.
What's fascinating here is that this is a total rejection of their neighbors' systems.
Right. In Egypt, as we said, the pharaoh is divine. His word shapes reality. In Babylon, the king is the supreme agent of the gods on earth. Whatever he dictates is justice. But in Israel, the king is a mortal who is conditionally anointed. He is subject to a pre-existing covenant. He is bound by a constitution of laws that he did not write and cannot rewrite.
And the mechanism for enforcing that accountability was an entirely new class of historical figures, the prophets.
Right, and we really have to correct the modern misunderstanding of what a prophet is, because we tend to think of a prophet as a mystic staring into a crystal ball, predicting the end of the world or the coming of a Messiah centuries in the future.
Like a fortune teller.
Yeah, exactly. But in their immediate historical context, they were doing something much more dangerous.
The prophets were essentially covenant prosecutors. Figures like Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah were not state bureaucrats, nor were they usually part of the official temple priesthood. They were independent, fiercely uncompromising truth-tellers who operated outside the halls of power.
And their job was intense.
Very. Their primary job was to point an accusing finger directly at the king, the royal courts, and the wealthy elites, and indict them for breaking the fundamental laws of the covenant.
Think about the mechanics of that. You have Amos, who was a shepherd and a fig tree farmer from the south, marching into the affluent northern capital and standing in the public square. He doesn't bring a polite petition. He screams at the wealthy elites.
He really goes after them.
He does. He accuses the judges of taking bribes and selling the poor for a pair of sandals. He mocks the wealthy women of the city, calling them the cows of Bashan, who oppressed the needy to buy more wine. It's so visceral.
And they struck directly at the hypocrisy of the state religion. The prophets delivered a terrifying message. Ritual sacrifice without social justice is repugnant to the divine. You can burn all the incense you want, you can slaughter thousands of sheep at the temple altar, but if you are using false weights in the marketplace to cheat the poor, and if you're using predatory loans to steal land from the vulnerable, your worship is not just empty, it is actively offensive to God.
Look at the broader implications of that. We are talking about an ancient civilization that literally wrote down, preserved, and canonized texts that aggressively condemned their own rulers.
Yeah.
No other ancient empire did this.
Never.
If you read the palace walls in Assyria, it is a relentless feed of imperial propaganda. It is the king boasting about how many cities he burned, how many enemies he impaled, and how perfect his reign is. The Israelites wrote stories about their kings failing, cheating, and being judged by peasant prophets. They basically invented the concept of the anti-imperial conscience.
They established the paradigm that earthly power is fundamentally accountable to a higher moral standard. But as revolutionary as that ideology was, a moral conscience alone does not stop an incoming army.
Unfortunately, no.
The geopolitical reality of the Levant was about to catch up with them. The United Monarchy splits into two weaker kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And looming on the horizon is the most ruthless military machine the ancient world had ever seen.
So we have to move into the crucible of conflict, because the survival of this accountable kingdom was put to the ultimate physical test. When you are a small state in the crosshairs of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, your public works projects aren't about building pretty monuments or statues.
No time for that.
Right. Your infrastructure is purely about survival engineering. Let's look at what they actually built in the dirt to stay alive.
Well, we mentioned terracing for agriculture, but defensive architecture was paramount. The most critical point of any ancient city was its gates. Israelite city gates were massive, complex, multi-chambered fortresses.
Right, because that's the weak point.
Exactly. If an enemy breached the outer doors, they were trapped in a courtyard surrounded by guard chambers, essentially a kill zone. But in times of peace, these gates functioned as the civic heart of the city. Because the gates were the most heavily fortified and spacious areas, they served as the courthouse, the marketplace, and the public square where the elders gathered to resolve disputes.
But the ultimate vulnerability for any ancient walled city under siege is water. If an enemy army surrounds your walls, they don't even have to attack. They just cut off your water supply, wait for you to die of thirst, and walk in over the corpses.
A brutal but effective tactic.
Which leads us to what I consider one of the most astonishing feats of ancient engineering, Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem. Walk us through the terror that prompted this construction and the physics of how they actually built it.
The context is the late 8th century BCE. The Neo-Assyrian Empire has perfected the art of terror and siege warfare. They utilize mass archers, massive wooden siege ramps, and battering rams that systematically dismantle stone walls.
Just a war machine.
In 722 BCE, the Assyrians obliterate the northern kingdom of Israel. The 10 northern tribes are deported, scattered across the empire, and effectively erased from history.
Gone.
Gone. 2 decades later, in 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib turns his war machine south, intent on crushing the kingdom of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem.
And King Hezekiah of Judah knows the Assyrians are coming. He knows exactly what they did to the north. And Jerusalem has a fatal flaw. Its primary water source, the Gihon Spring, is located outside the city's defensive walls down in the Kidron Valley.
That's a huge problem.
Right. If the Assyrians arrive, they simply camp at the spring, the city dehydrates, and it's over.
Hezekiah's solution is desperate and brilliant. He orders the spring outside the walls to be completely concealed and blocked up so the Assyrians can't find it. Simultaneously, he commands his engineers to carve a subterranean tunnel through the solid limestone bedrock of the city.
To redirect the water.
Yes, redirecting the water from the hidden spring into the pool of Siloam, which was safely inside the city's newly expanded walls.
The mechanics of this are mind-bending. This isn't a straight pipe. It is an S-shaped curve twisting through the rock for over 1,700 feet. And they were racing against the clock before the Assyrian army arrived.
They had to work fast.
So to cut the time in half, they started 2 separate teams of diggers on opposite ends, one at the spring, one at the pool, swinging sledgehammers and pickaxes in total darkness, intending to meet somewhere in the middle of a solid mountain. How do 2 teams digging blindly through stone manage to find each other without modern surveying equipment?
It is a masterclass in acoustic engineering and geological adaptation. Geologists believe the engineers identified a natural curse fissure.
Which is like a crack in the rock.
Exactly, a pre-existing winding crack in the limestone where water naturally seeped through. The 2 teams essentially followed this meandering natural fault line. As they got closer, they used acoustic sounding. They would strike the rock and listen for the reverberations of the pickaxes from the opposing team, constantly correcting their angle based on the sound traveling through the stone.
And we know this because they left an incredible receipt. The Siloam inscription. Carved into the wall near the meeting point, it literally describes the final frantic moments of the dig.
It's an amazing historical document.
It really is. It reads that while there were still 3 cubits to be cut through, the men could hear the voices of their counterparts calling out from the other side. They swung their axes, rock met rock, and the water flowed. I love this because it is the exact opposite of an Egyptian pyramid.
How do you mean?
Well, a pyramid is built high in the sky to project power and immortality to the world. Hezekiah's tunnel is built deep underground, invisible, in total darkness, for no other reason than to survive the empire. It is defensive theology made physical. Think of it like a submarine rigging for silent running, cutting off all external vulnerabilities, hiding deep beneath the surface, just trying to endure the depth charges from the Assyrian war machine above.
That's a great analogy. And Jerusalem did survive that siege. But the rest of Judah was not so fortunate. The Assyrian campaign of 701 BCE devastated the Judean countryside. And this provides us with one of the most remarkable instances of historical cross-referencing.
At Lachish, right.
Yes. The Assyrians laid a brutal siege to Lachish, which was Judah's second most important fortified city. We have the archaeological remains of the siege ramp built by the Assyrians, constructed from thousands of tons of stones pushed up against the city walls.
But we also have the Assyrian version of the story carved into stone.
We do. If you go to the British Museum today, you can look at the massive limestone reliefs that were excavated from Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh. These reliefs are the ancient equivalent of a cinematic propaganda film.
They're huge.
They depict the siege of Lachish in horrifying, triumphant detail. You see the Assyrian siege engines rolling up the ramps, you see the Judean defenders raining down flaming torches, and you see the aftermath. Judea leaders being impaled alive on stakes, families being deported with their meager belongings, and the Assyrian king sitting on a throne reviewing the spoils.
The Assyrians carved this into their palace wall to boast. It is pure, unfiltered imperial pride. But when you read the biblical text regarding the exact same Assyrian invasion, it is framed as a devastating tragedy and a divine warning.
Right, two completely different narratives.
You have the same historical event processed through two completely opposing narrative lenses. The Assyrians say, look at our unstoppable power. The Judahite texts say, look at the devastation our sins have brought upon us.
And that framework of interpreting disaster through a moral lens was about to face its ultimate test. Because Jerusalem survived Assyria, but just over a century later, the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted again. The Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire rose to take its place.
Enter Babylon.
Exactly. In 586 BCE, under King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians lay siege to Jerusalem.
And this time, there is no last-minute reprieve. The Babylonians breach the walls, the city is subjected to starvation, King Zedekiah is captured, forced to watch his sons executed, and then he is blinded and taken to Babylon in bronze chains. The city is put to the torch.
It's total devastation.
And most devastatingly, Solomon's temple, the epicenter of their religion, the place where heaven and earth supposedly intersected, is looted, smashed to pieces, and burned to the ground. The elites, the scribes, the priests, and the artisans are marched hundreds of miles east into exile in Babylon.
Militarily, politically, infrastructurally, and geographically, this is complete catastrophic collapse. In the logic of the ancient Near East, when a nation is conquered and its temple is destroyed, the theological math is indisputable. Your God has been defeated by the enemy's God.
Right, it's a proxy war between gods.
Exactly. Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, had utterly crushed YHWH, the god of Judah. Game over. The rational response for the exiles in Babylon was to assimilate, worship Marduk, and fade into the melting pot of the empire. This is exactly what happened to the Moabites, the Edomites, and the 10 northern tribes of Israel. They disappeared.
But the Judahites in Babylon didn't disappear. And the reason they didn't disappear involves arguably the most profound cognitive leap in the history of religion. Facing the absolute collapse of their worldview, they refused to accept that their God was weak.
They had to rethink everything.
They needed a mechanism to explain how a sovereign, all-powerful God could allow his own temple to be burned and his own people to be enslaved. So the prophets and theologians in exile formulated a radical thesis.
They concluded that their God had not been defeated by Babylon. Instead, they reasoned that their God was actually the sovereign architect of the entire universe, and he was actively using the Babylonian Empire as a tool of moral judgment against them.
Which is just a brilliant pivot.
It really is. The prophets looked back at centuries of their own history and argued, we broke the covenant. We failed to execute justice. We oppressed the poor. We polluted the land with idolatry. Therefore, God brought the Babylonians to discipline us.
Let's really analyze the mechanics of that pivot. It is an extraordinary use of cognitive dissonance. They took the most humiliating, horrific military defeat imaginable, the loss of their homes, their freedom, and their sacred space, and they transformed it into moral history. By blaming themselves, they preserved the supreme power of their God.
Because if God was punishing them for breaking a contract, it meant that the contract still existed.
Yes. It meant that Babylon wasn't the ultimate power in the universe, God was. And if God was merely disciplining them, it meant he wasn't finished with them. There was a mechanism for repentance, which meant there was a mechanism for hope. Defeat was not the end of the story. It was a harsh chapter in an ongoing relationship.
But this cognitive leap required a massive theological evolution. I mean, if you believe your God is powerful enough to orchestrate the movements of a foreign empire across the globe, your understanding of that God has to expand.
Right.
This brings us directly to the historical evolution of moral monotheism.
This is a major point of friction between the traditional Sunday school version of history and the archaeological reality. We tend to assume that Abraham walked out of the desert one day with a fully formed, strict monotheism, and the Israelites were strictly monotheistic ever since.
That's the popular conception, yeah.
But the secular historical consensus paints a much messier, more gradual picture. They emerged out of a rich, polytheistic Canaanite culture.
The archaeological evidence heavily suggests that early Israelite religion was not strict monotheism, which is the belief that only one God exists in the universe. Rather, it was something closer to monolatry.
Explain the difference between monotheism and monolatry, because it's crucial here.
Monolatry is the exclusive worship of one supreme God, without actively denying that other gods might exist and hold power over other nations.
Ah.
The early Israelites worshipped YHWH as their national patron deity, the god who brought them out of Egypt. But the cultural air they breathed was saturated with the broader Canaanite pantheon. You had El, the ancient high god of the Canaanites. You had Bel, the storm and fertility god.
And worshipping a storm god is incredibly tempting for highland farmers entirely dependent on rain.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
And the physical dirt proves this wasn't just a minor French issue. Archaeologists excavating Judean homes constantly find pillar figurines, these small clay statues of a female fertility goddess. Even more striking, excavations at a site called Kuntalet Ajrud found pottery fragments with inscriptions that literally read, "I bless you by YHWH of Samaria and is Assyria."
And Asherah was a major ancient Near Eastern mother goddess.
Yes, the evidence indicates that many ordinary Israelites, and even some kings, worshipped YHWH alongside other deities, or even envisioned YHWH as having a divine consort. The biblical texts don't actually hide this reality. They're largely a record of the prophets furiously screaming at the people to stop doing it.
Right, they're constantly fighting it.
The prophets are constantly tearing down the high places and condemning the worship of Baal and Asherah. But it is precisely in the crucible of the Babylonian exile that this monolatry finally, definitively, crystallizes into strict philosophical monotheism. The prophets of the exile, like 2nd Isaiah, declare unequivocally, "There are no other gods. The idols of Babylon are just wood and stone. There is only one creator of the universe, and he demands ethical behavior."
But the way they framed that ethical behavior is completely counterintuitive to how we view religion today.
How so?
Well, if you look at major world religions now, there is a massive emphasis on the afterlife. Getting to heaven, avoiding hell, securing a favorable reincarnation. Look at the Egyptians. Their entire culture revolved around the Book of the Dead, preserving the body, and the intricate weighing of the soul in the underworld to achieve eternal life.
Right.
But when you look at the early Hebrew texts, heaven as a destination for human souls is virtually absent. Here's where it gets really interesting. Where did they think they went when they died?
They had a concept called Sheol. And Sheol was not heaven, and it was not hell in the medieval sense of a place of fiery torment. The Jewish Encyclopedia and biblical scholarship describes Sheol as a shadowy, silent, dreary underworld beneath the earth.
It sounds bleak.
It was the great equalizer. Kings, peasants, the righteous and the wicked, everyone went to the dust of Sheol. It was a place of fading memory, devoid of the vibrant life and light of the upper world.
So if there is no grand reward of heaven to earn and no fiery hell to avoid, what is the motivation to be a good person? What is the function of the religion?
The function of the religion was entirely focused on the present. Because the afterlife was an underdeveloped shadow, 100% of the moral weight of the universe was placed on this life, on this earth. Wow. The material world was not something to escape. It was the sacred arena created by God and declared good in Genesis. The goal of religion wasn't to evacuate your soul to a spiritual realm. The goal was to bring justice, holiness, reign, and covenant faithfulness to the dirt and soil of the physical world you lived in.
Religion was meant for a Tuesday morning. It was brutally practical.
It radically transformed the mundane into the sacred. Holiness wasn't confined to the high priest operating behind the veil in the temple. Holiness was brought right into the domestic sphere, into the four-room house. The divine was at your dinner table.
Let's look at the mechanics of how that worked. Take the dietary laws keeping kosher. Distinguishing between clean and unclean animals meant that every single time you sat down to eat 3 times a day, you had to consciously pause and make a decision based on your covenant with God.
It builds mindfulness into survival.
Exactly. Or consider the agricultural laws we talked about, leaving the edges of the field for the poor. That turns the physical act of harvesting wheat into an act of ethical worship. Even the human body itself was marked by the covenant through circumcision. Sex, farming, eating, working, every aspect of biological and economic survival was laced with divine significance.
And this brings us to the most brilliant, albeit accidental, consequence of that system. By moving the locus of holiness away from a single geographic building and infusing it into the daily bodily habits of the people, the Hebrews inadvertently engineer the ultimate survival mechanism.
The portable civilization?
Exactly. When the Babylonians finally arrived, smashed the temple to rubble, deported the king, and destroyed the geographical state, the Hebrews were uniquely prepared. They didn't lose their religion because their religion was already living in their kitchens, in their bodies, and in their perception of time.
They developed what I can only describe as the ultimate technology. Now, when we say technology in the ancient world, we usually mean metallurgy, smelting bronze into iron, or inventing the spoked wheel for a chariot. But the Hebrews developed something far more resilient.
The tools of this technology were not original to them. I mean, they did not invent the alphabet, and they did not invent the concept of a calendar, but they weaponized text and time for the sake of cultural survival.
Let's start with text. We have an artifact called the Gezer calendar, dating back to the 10th century BCE. It's a small piece of limestone with writing on it. It's not high literature. It looks like it might have been a schoolboy's practice drill.
Just a basic list.
Yeah, it just lists the agricultural rhythm of the year. 2 months of planting, 2 months of late sowing, a month of pulling flax, a month of barley harvest, a month of wheat harvest, 2 months of pruning vines, a month of summer fruit. It's the simple, grounded rhythm of an agrarian life. But over the centuries, that rudimentary literacy evolved.
It evolved into a profound scribal tradition. Instead of just recording crop yields or royal tax receipts, the scribes began to record their ancestral stories, their complex laws, and the blistering critiques of their prophets. Writing became the primary vessel for their collective memory.
And then they weaponized time itself. They took the calendar, specifically the 7-day week, and instituted the Sabbath. We completely take the weekend for granted today. We think of it as a time to mow the lawn or catch up on sleep. But you pointed out earlier that the Sabbath was a revolutionary piece of social technology. Explain the mechanics of why resting for one day was an act of anti-imperial protest.
You have to view it through the lens of an ancient command economy. In Egypt or Assyria, time belongs to the state. The empire demands constant, endless production. You make bricks, you build monuments, you harvest grain to pay tribute to the king every single day until you die.
There are no weekends in Egypt.
No weekends at all. Your value is strictly tied to your output. The institution of the Sabbath was a radical disruption of that system. It dictated that 1 day out of 7, all production must cease. Time does not belong to the pharaoh. Time belongs to God, and therefore it belongs to rest.
And the mechanics of the law are incredibly specific. It's not just the wealthy elite who get a day off to lounge around.
Exactly the opposite. The commandment in Deuteronomy explicitly lists who must rest.
Yeah.
You, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, the foreigner residing in your towns, and crucially, your ox, your donkey, and all your livestock.
Even the animals get a day off.
Yes. Every living creature within the community, regardless of social class or economic utility, is granted the inherent dignity of rest. It is a boundary drawn in time that the relentless machinery of the empire is forbidden to cross.
I want to use a modern analogy to explain exactly what they accomplished during the Babylonian exile. Imagine a civilization is like a vast computer network. The Egyptian or Assyrian model is tied to a massive physical mainframe, a colossal stone temple, a physical king sitting on a physical throne, and a specific bordered territory.
Right, highly centralized hardware.
If an enemy army comes in and takes a sledgehammer to that mainframe, the hardware is destroyed, the data is wiped, and the civilization crashes permanently. Babylon took a sledgehammer to the Judahite mainframe in 586 BCE, but instead of crashing, the Judahites essentially uploaded their civilization to the cloud.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize the shift from a geographic state to a textual community.
Because you cannot carry the massive stone walls of Jerusalem across 1,000 miles of desert into exile. You cannot pack the bronze altar of the temple in your luggage. But you can carry a scroll. You can carry the recipe for a Passover meal and teach it to your children in a foreign kitchen. You can carry the memory of the Exodus. You can carry the physical practice of resting on the seventh day. They took their entire identity, their laws, their ethics, and their history, and they turned it into cultural software.
They created a portable homeland that existed entirely in the minds and shared practices of the community.
And the mechanics of this upload occurred right there in Babylon.
Yes. During the exile, without a temple to offer sacrifices, the priests and scribes turned their frantic energy toward the texts. They gathered their oral traditions, their prophetic scrolls, and their historical records, and they compiled, edited, and canonized them. Studying the law replaced sacrificing animals as the highest form of worship. Gathering in small communities to read the texts became the precursor to the synagogue.
So even when they are sitting by the rivers of Babylon, weeping for Zion, as the famous psalm says, they are still a coherent people. They are executing the code of their civilization offline.
And that portability enabled one of the most critical survivals in world history. Decades later, the Babylonian Empire is conquered by the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus issues an edict allowing the exiled Judeans to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple.
A huge turning point.
Massive. But the religion that returns is not the same royal, temple-dependent cult that left. We see the firm birth of post-exilic Judaism. The identity is now text-centered. It is centered around scribes, the reading of the Torah, and the realization that they can survive in the diaspora. They proved that a people could lose their sovereign territory and their king, yet remain an unbroken community.
And the code they wrote in that portable civilization didn't just survive the ancient world, it was downloaded into the very foundations of the modern world. We interact with their legacy every single day. But what makes this legacy so compelling is that the people who transmitted it were not perfect, flawless demigods. Let's look at the heroes of this story because the text goes out of its way to show us how incredibly broken they were.
The Hebrew tradition adamantly refuses to sanitize its founders. Think of the patriarch Jacob, the man who is literally renamed Israel and becomes the father of the 12 tribes. He is introduced as a deceiver who tricks his blind father to steal his brother's inheritance and later wrestles in the dirt with a divine being.
Right, and Moses, the ultimate lawgiver who confronts Pharaoh, is a man who commits murder in Egypt, constantly doubts his own speaking ability, loses his temper with his own people, and is ultimately barred from entering the Promised Land.
The same goes for their kings and judges. David, the glorious poet king, abuses his absolute power to commit adultery with Bathsheba and then orchestrates the cold-blooded battlefield murder of her husband Uriah to cover it up.
It's a dark story.
And Samson, the superpower judge, is an impulsive, violent, emotionally unstable anti-hero who is ultimately captured, blinded, and destroys himself in a collapsing temple.
Consider the aesthetic difference between this and imperial propaganda. If you examine the royal inscriptions of Ramses II of Egypt or Sennacherib of Assyria, the propaganda demands absolute perfection. The king never loses a battle. The king is never at fault. The king never sins. To admit a flaw is to project weakness. But the Hebrews wrote sprawling, detailed epics about the catastrophic moral failures of their greatest leaders.
Which is so unusual for the time.
Right. So what does this all mean? Why record the worst moments of your founding fathers for eternity?
I think it is a brilliant survival mechanism. By acknowledging that human beings are a mess, that even the people chosen for the most profound divine purposes can fail spectacularly. They inoculated their culture against the inevitable failure of human leadership.
They separated the law from the man.
Yes, they recognized that the law is eternal, but the people administering it are flawed. That brutal, self-critical honesty makes the texts infinitely relatable to human beings thousands of years later.
And the echoes of those texts and the moral framework they constructed reverberate through almost every aspect of modern society. We've discussed the Sabbath, which directly laid the conceptual groundwork for the modern weekend, labor rights, and the ethical limitation of work. We discussed the prophets demanding that the king is subject to the law, which is the foundational root of modern constitutionalism and the rule of law. And look at the Exodus narrative. The story of slaves confronting a divine king and marching out of Egypt became the ultimate global template for civil rights and liberation movements. "Let my people go" is not just an ancient quote. It has been sung by enslaved people in the American South, by civil rights marchers crossing bridges, and by oppressed groups worldwide who use that specific ancient software to articulate their own demand for dignity.
It's a powerful template.
It really is. They mapped out a moral arc of history that says a society is judged not by the height of its monument, the size of its GDP, or the lethality of its military, but by how it treats the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner.
The most direct legacy, of course, is the Abrahamic family of religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all draw directly from this ancient wellspring of moral monotheism, prophetic critique, and the belief that history has a moral destination. Now, it is important to state clearly that the ancient highland farmers, Israelites, and Judeans we have traced today are not a one-to-one equivalent with the modern state of Israel or modern geopolitics.
Right, context is key.
Exactly. There are thousands of years of complex diaspora, theological evolution, and modern history sitting between the two. However, modern Jewish identity and peoplehood draw incredibly deeply on these ancient, resilient mechanisms of language, text, and communal memory.
Well, this has been a staggering journey. We started with a bunch of vulnerable farmers scratching out a living on rain-dependent, terraced hillsides. We watched them invent a socially embedded economy to protect their families from debt slavery.
We saw them reluctantly hire kings.
Right, to fend off their neighbors while simultaneously inventing prophets to scream at those kings when they became corrupt. We watched them dig tunnels through solid rock to survive the Assyrian war machine. And finally, when the Babylonians burned their physical world to the ground, they didn't surrender. They made a massive cognitive leap, preserved the sovereignty of their god, and uploaded their entire identity into a portable civilization of text and time.
If the ancient Hebrews proved anything, it is that the most durable, indestructible civilizations are not built out of impenetrable stone walls, bronze weapons, or territorial dominance. They are built out of shared stories, ethical obligations, and communal memory.
And that leaves us with a critical question to consider about our own trajectory.
It does. Today, we are obsessed with building vast digital empires, physical infrastructure, and technological dominance. We trust our hardware. But if our systems collapse tomorrow, if the power grids failed and our digital monuments vanish, do we possess the shared moral memory, the underlying ethical framework, and the portable identity necessary to survive the way they did?
A civilization isn't the stone you build with. It's the story you can carry when the stone breaks.